Patricia Morales discovered she'd been erased from her own life on a Tuesday afternoon, standing outside her flagship restaurant, watching a manager she'd never met lock her out like she was a stranger asking for spare change. 35 years, 8 restaurants, every recipe, every system, every reason customers drove across town for her grandmother's mole sauce, all of it built by her hands. And now a 20-something kid with a clipboard was telling her she needed an appointment to enter the building that still had her maiden name carved into the cornerstone. She was 65 years old. Her husband Daniel had been dead exactly 6 weeks, and somehow, in that brief window of grief, Patricia had become invisible. The restaurant smelled wrong, even from the sidewalk. That was the first thing she noticed. The aroma drifting through the door wasn't the complex layerings of cumin and chocolate and poblano peppers that she'd perfected over decades. It was generic, flat, the kind of smell that came from pre-made sauce packets and shortcuts that saved money but killed soul. Patricia stood there on Alameda Street in downtown Los Angeles, watching lunch customers stream in and out of Casa Morales, her restaurant, her legacy, her life's work, and felt the world tilt sideways in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with recognition. Something was very, very wrong. Daniel's heart attack had been sudden, massive. He'd been reviewing contracts at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, coffee growing cold beside him, when he'd simply stopped breathing. Patricia had been experimenting with a new variation on her abuela's pipián sauce, testing ratios of pumpkin seeds and tomatillos when she'd heard the sound of his coffee mug hitting the floor. The funeral had been a blur. Her daughter Simone had handled everything: the service, the flowers, the endless stream of people offering condolences Patricia could barely process. Simone and her husband Trevor had been so capable, so organized, taking care of details Patricia couldn't focus on, while her mind kept circling back to the same thought. Daniel was supposed to be there. They'd built this together. How was she supposed to run 8 restaurants without him? "Mom, you can't," Simone said gently 3 days after they'd buried Daniel in the cemetery overlooking the hills. "You can't run the business alone. It's too much. You need to rest, to grieve. Let Trevor and me handle things for a while." Patricia had nodded, grateful. Simone had her MBA. Trevor worked in corporate finance. They understood the business side in ways Patricia never had. She'd always been the operations person, the one who trained staff, perfected recipes, handled the daily grind of keeping 8 busy kitchens running smoothly. Daniel had been the one who dealt with lawyers and accountants and expansion plans. "The restaurants are in trouble," Simone had told her 2 weeks later, her voice heavy with concern. "Dad made some risky investments before he died, extended too much credit. The debt situation it's bad, Mom. We might need to sell some locations just to keep the others afloat." Patricia had felt the floor drop out from under her. "Sell? Which ones?" "We're not sure yet. Trevor's reviewing all the financials. But, Mom, I think you should consider moving somewhere smaller. The house is so big now, and the property taxes alone are eating into what we can salvage from the business." Somewhere smaller turned out to be a 1-bedroom apartment in Glendale. Modest, Simone called it, appropriate for a widow on a fixed income. Patricia had moved in a daze, boxing up 35 years of marriage, 40 years of recipe notebooks, decades of family photos and kitchen tools, and the accumulated debris of a life she thought was permanent. The allowance Simone set up was $2,800 a month, enough to cover rent and groceries and not much else. When Patricia asked about the business finances, about seeing the books Daniel had always kept so carefully organized, Simone had squeezed her hand with infinite patience. "Mom, you're still grieving. The numbers would just stress you out. Trevor and I have it under control. You just focus on taking care of yourself." So Patricia had tried. She'd gone to the grief support group at the community center. She'd reorganized her tiny apartment. She'd cooked elaborate meals for one that she mostly couldn't eat. And she'd watched her daughter's Instagram account, where Simone posted glossy photos of Casa Morales restaurants thriving. Packed dining rooms, celebrity customers, glowing reviews. But if the restaurants were thriving, why did they need to be sold to cover debt? That question had nagged Patricia for 3 weeks before she decided to visit the flagship location, just to see it, just to remember what she and Daniel had built together, just to feel close to him in the space they'd created. The manager, some kid named Brandon who looked barely old enough to drink, had stopped her at the door. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll need a reservation. We're fully booked for lunch service." "I don't need a reservation," Patricia had said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Patricia Morales. This is my restaurant." Brandon had looked at her with the polite confusion of someone dealing with a confused elderly woman. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the owners are Simone and Trevor Hayes. If you'd like to speak with them, you'll need to call the main office and set up an appointment." Patricia had stood there, speechless, as Brandon had gently but firmly closed the door in her face. Erased. That was the word that kept circling through her mind as she'd walked back to her car in the parking structure Daniel had negotiated a discount for 15 years ago. She'd been erased from her own life like she'd never existed. At home, Patricia had pulled out the boxes she'd hastily packed from the house, the ones Simone had been so eager to help her organize. She'd found her copy of the operating agreement Daniel had insisted they file when they'd opened the third location, the partnership papers that legally documented who owned what. She'd read them 3 times, hands shaking, before the words fully registered. Patricia Morales, 60% ownership. Daniel Morales, 40% ownership. They'd done it 10 years ago, Daniel explaining that it was protection for her, making sure she'd be taken care of if anything happened to him, making sure their life's work would stay in her hands. 60%. She'd owned the majority of their business for a decade and hadn't really thought about it because Daniel had always handled the business side and she'd always handled everything else, and their partnership had been so seamless that ownership percentages seemed like a technicality. But Daniel was gone, and somehow, impossibly, Patricia's 60% ownership had vanished along with him. The attorney Patricia hired was a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Santos, who'd handled a dozen cases of family business fraud and who looked at Patricia's documents with the focused intensity of a surgeon identifying cancer. "Your daughter forged your signature," Rebecca said flatly, spreading papers across her desk. "These documents showing you as a salaried employee instead of a majority owner. This isn't your signature. It's close, but it's not yours. And these transfer documents supposedly signed by you giving ownership to Simone, also forged." Patricia felt sick. "But why would she—" "Because your restaurants are worth approximately $12 million, Rebecca interrupted, "and your daughter has been systematically selling them to a franchise corporation. She's already completed sales on 4 locations for $6 million. The remaining 4 are in various stages of negotiation." $6 million? While Patricia lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on $2,800 a month? "What can I do?" Patricia asked, her voice barely steady. Rebecca's smile was sharp. "We can destroy her. Fraud charges, criminal prosecution, injunction stopping all sales, asset seizure. Your daughter would be looking at significant prison time, And we'd win. The evidence is overwhelming. Patricia thought about Simone at 6 years old, standing on a stool beside her in the original Casa Morales kitchen, carefully stirring the mole sauce and asking 1,000 questions about why chocolate made savory food taste better. She thought about Simone's college graduation, how proud Daniel was, how they'd celebrated at the restaurant with the entire staff joining in. She thought about how Simone had grown up watching her father get all the credit for their success, how every article about Casa Morales featured Daniel's photo, Daniel's vision, Daniel's business acumen, how Patricia had always been mentioned in passing, if at all, supported by his wife's traditional family recipes. Simone had learned exactly what their culture and their industry had taught her, that men built businesses and women supported them, that the business side mattered and the operation side was just maintenance, that vision was valuable and execution was just labor. Patricia had spent 35 years being invisible in plain sight, and Simone had learned that her mother's invisibility was normal, expected, justified. Patricia told Rebecca, "I need some time to think about how I want to handle this." That evening, Patricia sat in her small apartment, surrounded by boxes she still hadn't fully unpacked, pulling out the 3-ring binder she'd kept meticulously for 35 years. Every recipe, handwritten with notes and modifications, every training manual she'd developed for new kitchen staff, every system she'd created for inventory management, quality control, customer service standards. The recipes were what stopped her. Her grandmother's mole sauce, the one that made Casa Morales famous, the pipián verde that food critics called transformative, the albóndiga soup that won awards, the tamales that sold out every Christmas season. Every single recipe included her abuela's secret ingredients, the specific ratio of chiles, the proprietary spice blend Patricia had spent 15 years perfecting, the technique for achieving the exact right consistency that made their sauces legendary. Simone didn't have these recipes, not the real ones. She had the basic versions they'd posted on the website for marketing. She had the simplified versions they'd given to food magazines. But she didn't have the actual formulas that made Casa Morales food taste like something people would drive an hour for. Without these recipes, the restaurants Simone was selling to the franchise company were just buildings and equipment and a brand name attached to food that would taste like every other chain restaurant in America. Patricia was holding the heart of her business in her hands, and Simone had no idea. The knock on her door came on Saturday afternoon. Patricia opened it to find Rosa standing there. Rosa, who'd worked as a line cook at Casa Morales for 20 years, who'd started as a scared teenager with minimal English and grown into one of their best kitchen managers. Rosa, who'd cried at Daniel's funeral and hugged Patricia so tightly she could barely breathe. Beside Rosa stood a teenage girl who looked nervous and hopeful at the same time. "Mrs. Patricia," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion, "this is my daughter, Maria. She has something she wants to show you." Maria held out a folder with shaking hands. "It's my college essay," she said quietly, "for my application to culinary school. I wrote it about you." Patricia took the folder, her hands trembling slightly, and read, "The Kitchen That Taught Me Dignity" by Maria Sanchez. "When my mother started working at Casa Morales, I was 5 years old. She would come home smelling like garlic and cumin, her hands rough from chopping and cleaning, her feet aching from 10-hour shifts. But she was happy in a way I didn't understand years later when Mrs. Patricia Morales let me visit the kitchen. Mrs. Patricia taught my mother more than recipes. She taught her that kitchen work was skilled labor deserving of respect. She paid fair wages when other restaurants exploited immigrant workers. She offered English classes and promoted from within. When my mother's citizenship papers came through, Mrs. Patricia threw a party for the entire staff. But more than that, Mrs. Patricia created a family. She remembered everyone's children's names. She closed the restaurants on Christmas Eve so staff could spend time with their families. She taught kitchen skills to anyone willing to learn, turning dishwashers into line cooks and line cooks into managers. My mother came to America with nothing. Mrs. Patricia gave her dignity, opportunity, and a place to belong. She showed me that a restaurant isn't just about food, it's about creating community. That's why I want to be a chef, not to become famous or win awards, but to create the kind of space Mrs. Patricia created, where people matter more than profit, where skill is taught and respected, where immigrants like my mother can build lives of purpose and pride. Mrs. Patricia probably doesn't remember the day she let a scared 10-year-old visit the kitchen, but I remember. I remember her teaching me how to properly dice an onion, how she explained that every dish tells a story, how she said that the best chefs are the ones who feed people's souls as well as their stomachs. When I open my restaurant someday, and I will, I'll hang a sign with her name on it because she showed me what success actually looks like. Patricia's vision blurred. She couldn't finish reading. 2 generations, Rosa said softly, sitting beside Patricia on the worn couch. You taught me. Now Maria wants to learn. But Mrs. Patricia, the restaurants aren't the same anymore. Simone changed everything. The new managers don't care about the staff. They hire cheap labor and treat people like they're disposable. They use different recipes. They taste okay, but they're not yours. They're not real. Maria spoke up, her voice gaining strength. When I heard what Simone did to you, I was so angry. I wanted to write a different essay about betrayal and injustice, but my mom said you were handling it. And I realized how you handle it matters, because if you destroy everything in revenge, then my essay becomes about destruction instead of building something beautiful. Patricia looked at this girl who'd written her college application essay about a woman she barely knew, based on the example Patricia had set, without even realizing people were watching. Rosa gripped Patricia's hand. What you do now, Maria will remember. All of us who worked for you will remember. You taught us that how you treat people matters more than how much money you make, that dignity matters, that creating community matters. If I destroy Simone, Sañez, Patricia said slowly, I teach Maria that revenge is justice, that family is disposable when money is involved. Yes, Rosa said quietly. And if you destroy the restaurants completely, you destroy the example you set. The story becomes about what was taken from you instead of what you built. Patricia sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of being watched by people she hadn't realized were paying attention. For 35 years, she thought she was just running restaurants, managing staff, perfecting recipes. She hadn't understood she was teaching a generation of workers how to treat people, how to create dignity in an industry that often exploited the vulnerable, how to build community in a culture that valued profit over people. Her legacy wasn't the restaurants, it wasn't the money, it wasn't even the recipes, though those mattered. Her legacy were the Rosas and the Marias, the people who'd learned from watching her that another way was possible. And how she handled Simone's betrayal would teach more than 35 years of running restaurants ever had. The meeting with Simone took place in Rebecca's office on a Wednesday afternoon. Trevor was there too, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. Simone had the determined expression of someone preparing for battle. Rebecca laid out the evidence methodically, the forged signatures, the fraudulent ownership transfers, the illegal sales, the criminal charges they could file, the years of prison time Simone was facing. Patricia watched her daughter's face go pale, then defiant, then terrified. "Mom," Simone said, her voice cracking, "I was protecting Dad's legacy. You don't understand business. You never did. You just cooked." I just cooked, Patricia repeated quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca started to intervene, but Patricia held up her hand. Simone, do you know why Casa Morales succeeded when 90% of restaurants fail in the first year? Dad's business acumen, his vision, my systems, my training programs, my quality control standards, my relationship with staff who stayed for decades because I treated them like human beings instead of labor costs, my recipes that people drove across the city for, my consistency that built customer loyalty, my attention to every single detail that made the difference between a restaurant and a home. She pulled out one of her binders. Your father handled contracts and financing and expansion. That mattered. But Simone, I built everything those contracts were based on. Every system, every standard, every recipe, every reason customers chose us over the other 100 Mexican restaurants in Los Angeles. I didn't. Simone stopped, looking lost. You didn't, Patricia finished. Because I was invisible, because the industry gave your father credit for everything, because our culture taught you that men build and women support. You grew up thinking I was just the cook, that what I did wasn't real business. She opened the binder. She pulled out one of her binders. These are the real recipes. Every dish that made us famous, your abuela's secret ingredients, the specific ratios I spent 15 years perfecting, the techniques that can't be replicated from photos or taste tests. Simone's eyes widened as she understood. The franchise locations are serving mediocre food under our family name. Within a year, customers will stop coming. The franchise company will realize they bought a brand without the substance behind it. They'll sue you for misrepresentation. You'll lose the $6 million and face criminal charges on top of it. Trevor looked sick. Simone, what did you do? I thought, Simone's voice broke. I thought you just followed recipes anyone could use. I thought the value was in the brand, the locations, the business structure Dad built. I didn't know that I was the business, Patricia said, not angry, just tired. That every valuable thing about Casa Morales came from 35 years of me showing up every day and building something from the ground up while your father got the credit. The silence stretched. Finally, Patricia spoke again. I can destroy you, Simone. Rebecca has enough evidence to send you to prison. I can sue for the $6 million you stole. I can revoke my recipes and watch the franchise locations fail and let them sue you for fraud. I can reclaim my restaurants and erase you the same way you erased me. Simone was crying now, silently, mascara streaking down her face. But I'm not going to do that, Patricia continued, because Rosa's daughter, Maria, wrote her college essay about me, about what I taught her mother, about the example I set. And if I choose revenge, I teach Maria that destruction is justice, that family is disposable, that the person with power should use it to hurt the people who hurt them. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the woman who'd forged documents and stolen millions, but the little girl who'd stood on a stool stirring mole sauce and asking why chocolate made everything taste better. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia said. You're going to return my 60% ownership. You're going to step down from operations. I'm taking back the 4 unsold restaurants. The 4 sold locations, I'm going to license my recipes to the franchise company. Real recipes. Because those kitchens employ people like Rosa who need their jobs and don't deserve to lose them because of your mistakes. Mom, I'm not finished. You're going to work alongside me for 2 years, not as punishment, as education. You're going to do the work I did for 35 years. Manage operations, train staff, perfect recipes, handle the daily grind of keeping kitchens running smoothly. You're going to learn what I actually contributed." "Why?" "Because you're going to co-teach with me at the Culinary Institute I'm opening. You're going to tell your story to students like Maria. You're going to admit that you dismissed your mother's contributions because you'd been taught they didn't matter. And you're going to teach the next generation not to make the same mistake." She pulled out the legal settlement Rebecca had drafted. "There's a trust for your children's education. They can access it when they turn 18. If you complete the 2-year training program, you'll receive 30% ownership of the remaining 4 restaurants. The other 30% goes to your children when they're 25. I keep 40%. "You're giving me ownership? After what I did?" "I'm giving you the chance to earn it by learning what ownership actually means, by understanding what you almost destroyed, by becoming someone who sees value where you saw nothing." Patricia stood up. "This isn't forgiveness, Simone. Forgiveness comes later, maybe. This is education. This is me refusing to let your ignorance be the end of this story. This is me choosing to build something lasting instead of destroying something broken." She looked at Rebecca. "Draw up the settlement. Simone has 24 hours to decide." As Patricia walked out of the office, she heard Simone crying behind her. She didn't turn around. Some lessons required sitting with consequences before understanding could dawn. The Heritage Kitchen Institute opened 6 months later in the original Casa Morales location, the first restaurant Patricia and Daniel had built together 40 years ago. The front dining room had been converted into teaching space. The kitchen had been upgraded with stations for 20 students. The inaugural class was 20 immigrant women, most of them working kitchen jobs like Rosa had started with, all of them dreaming of something more. Patricia stood at the front of the classroom, Simone beside her, and looked at faces filled with hope and determination and the specific hunger that came from wanting to build something lasting. "This is my daughter Simone. She's going to tell you her story. Pay attention, because her mistakes are the ones you need to avoid." Simone took a shaky breath. For 6 months, she'd been working in the kitchens, doing the work her mother had done for decades. Her hands were rough now. Her feet ached. She'd cried more than once while trying to perfect the mole sauce, understanding finally how much skill and patience and artistry her mother had poured into every dish. 2 years ago, Simone said, her voice steady despite the emotion underneath, "I almost destroyed my family's legacy because I didn't understand what my mother had built. I thought she was just the cook. I thought the value was in the business side, the contracts, the financing, the expansion plans my father handled. I didn't see that everything valuable about our restaurants came from what my mother created every single day." She looked at the students. "I grew up watching my father get credit for our success. Every article, every award, every recognition mentioned his name. My mother was always supported by traditional family recipes, like recipes were just words on paper anyone could follow. I learned that men built businesses and women supported them, that vision mattered and execution was just labor." Patricia watched her daughter, seeing the transformation that 6 months of actual work had created. Simone had shown up the first day in designer clothes and expensive shoes, ready to help out in the kitchen. She'd left that first shift with burn marks on her arms, aching feet, and the dawning realization that what Patricia did every day required skills Simone didn't possess. "I forged documents," Simone continued, her voice breaking slightly. I stole my mother's ownership. I sold half our restaurants. I erased her from the business she'd built, and I convinced myself I was protecting my father's legacy. Really, I was destroying my mother's." She pulled out the recipes Patricia had withheld. "These are the real recipes. My grandmother's mole sauce, the pipián verde that won awards, every dish that made Casa Moramis famous. I didn't have them when I sold those 4 locations to the franchise company. I thought they were just cooking instructions anyone could replicate. I didn't understand that these recipes represent 15 years of my mother perfecting ratios, testing ingredients, adjusting techniques until she created something transcendent." Maria Sanchez raised her hand from the back row. "What happened when the franchise locations realized they didn't have the real recipes?" "Quality plummeted, customers complained, reviews tanked. The franchise company called my mother and begged her to license the real recipes. She agreed, not for me, but for the employees who needed their jobs. People like your mother, Maria, people who'd done nothing wrong but were suffering because of my ignorance." She looked at Patricia. "My mother could have destroyed me. She had every legal right, every moral justification. Instead, she made me work in the kitchens, made me do the job she'd done for 35 years, made me understand what I dismissed as just cooking." Patricia stepped forward. Simone made mistakes born from cultural blindness. She learned that women's contributions don't count, that the business side is what matters, and everything else is support work. But she's not unique. This industry, this culture, teaches that lesson over and over. She looked around at 20 women who'd all experienced some version of the same dismissal. How many of you have had your skills dismissed, your knowledge minimized, your contributions treated as less valuable than the real business? Every hand went up. This is what we're going to change, not by destroying the people who dismiss us, but by building something so undeniably valuable that dismissal becomes impossible, by teaching the next generation to see value where others see nothing, by creating examples that can't be ignored. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe for mole sauce. "This is where we start, with the most complex dish in our repertoire. You're going to learn every ingredient, every technique, every small adjustment that transforms good into extraordinary. And while you learn the cooking, you're going to learn something else." "What?" one student asked. "That the work of feeding people, creating gathering places, building community, that's not support work. That's sacred work. That's the heart of what makes us human. And anyone who dismisses it is missing the entire point." Over the next 2 years, Patricia watched Simone transform, slowly, painfully, through hundreds of hours of actual work that gave her calluses and burn scars and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from standing in a professional kitchen for 10-hour shifts. They worked side by side, mother and daughter, rebuilding a relationship that had been broken by cultural blindness and personal betrayal. It wasn't easy. Some days Simone was defensive, insisting she'd understood all along how hard the work was. Other days she was despairing, overwhelmed by how much she hadn't known. But gradually, grudgingly, honestly, Simone began to see. She saw it in the precision required to dice vegetables uniformly so they cooked evenly, in the timing needed to coordinate 10 different dishes coming out simultaneously, in the management skills required to train staff, maintain standards, handle customer complaints, manage inventory, troubleshoot equipment failures, and keep a kitchen running smoothly through holiday rushes and staff shortages. She saw it in Rosa, who'd been working in professional kitchens for 25 years and possessed knowledge that no business degree could teach. In the line cooks who could estimate ingredient quantities by eye with greater accuracy than any measuring tool. In the dishwashers who kept the entire operation running by ensuring a constant supply of clean equipment. Most of all, She saw it in her mother. Patricia, at 67, was sharper, more knowledgeable, more skilled than Simone had ever acknowledged. She could taste a sauce and identify every ingredient, every ratio, every technique used to create it. She could walk through a kitchen and spot problems before they became crises. She could manage staff with a combination of firmness and respect that created loyalty spanning decades. One afternoon during the dinner rush, Patricia watched Simone coordinate her station with growing confidence. The panic that had marked her first months had settled into focused competence. She was learning, changing, becoming someone who finally saw what had been invisible before. "She's good," Rosa said quietly, appearing beside Patricia with a tray of prepped vegetables. "Not as good as you, but good." "She's learning," Patricia said. "That's all I asked." Maria Sanchez got accepted to culinary school, full scholarship. She rewrote her college essay after everything that happened, about forgiveness and transformation, about how you chose education over revenge. Patricia felt tears prickling. "She's going to be extraordinary." "She already is, because you showed her another way." The final class of the Heritage Kitchen Institute's first 2-year program took place on a Saturday afternoon, graduation. 20 women who'd started as nervous students and emerged as confident cooks ready to launch their own food businesses. Patricia stood at the front of the room, Simone beside her, and looked at faces filled with pride and determination and the specific satisfaction that came from mastering something difficult. 2 years ago, many of you were working entry-level kitchen jobs, being dismissed, having your skills minimized, watching other people get credit for your contributions. Today, you're graduates of one of the most rigorous culinary programs in Los Angeles. You've mastered complex techniques, you've learned business management, you've developed your own signature dishes. You're ready to build something lasting. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But before you leave here, I want to tell you something important, something I learned the hard way. Your value doesn't come from other people recognizing it. It comes from you doing the work so well that dismissal becomes absurd." Maria Sanchez spoke up from the front row. "Mrs. Patricia, what happened with the franchise locations, the ones Simone sold?" "Good question," Patricia said. "Once I licensed them the proper recipes and proper training, quality improved dramatically. They're thriving now. Employees have better working conditions. Customers are happy. The franchise company is expanding." "So you helped the people who stole from you," another student said. "I helped the employees who did nothing wrong. I helped preserve my family's reputation. And yes, I helped the franchise company because destroying them would have hurt innocent people while teaching a lesson about revenge I didn't want to teach." Simone stepped forward. "My mother could have destroyed me. Every day I'm grateful she didn't. But more than not, I'm grateful she made me learn what I'd dismissed. These 2 years, working beside her, doing the job she did for 35 years, they taught me more than my MBA ever did." She looked at the graduates. "You're going to face dismissal. People will minimize your contributions, take credit for your work, treat you like you're disposable. And you'll have choices about how to respond. You can spend your energy destroying the people who dismissed you, or you can spend it building something so valuable that dismissal becomes irrelevant." Patricia watched her daughter, at the woman who'd forged documents and stolen millions and erased her mother from her own business, at the woman who'd spent 2 years working in kitchens until her hands were rough and her feet ached and her assumptions had been shattered by reality, at the woman who now taught others not to make the same mistakes. "We're offering a second cohort," Patricia announced. 20 more students, same rigorous program, same focus on skill and dignity and building sustainable businesses. But this time, Simone is going to be the lead instructor. The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Simone. "I'm not as skilled as my mother, honestly. I never will be. But I can teach you something she can't. I can teach you what dismissal looks like from the inside, how people rationalize not seeing value, how cultural blindness works, how to recognize when you're dismissing someone's contributions, and how to stop. She pulled out lesson plans she'd been developing. We're adding a new component, business management taught by someone who understands both sides, who knows what the business side looks like and what the operations side requires, who can bridge the gap between vision and execution, who can teach you how to make sure you get credit for what you build. Patricia felt something settle in her chest. This was what transformation looked like. Not perfection, not erasure of past mistakes, but honest acknowledgement of harm done and committed effort to prevent others from repeating those mistakes. After the graduation ceremony, after the students had dispersed with their certificates and their dreams and their grandmother's recipes carefully transcribed in their own notebooks, Patricia and Simone stood alone in the empty classroom. "Thank you," Simone said quietly, "for not destroying me, for teaching me what I should have seen all along." "Thank you for being willing to learn," Patricia replied. "Not everyone is." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, mother and daughter, separated by years of misunderstanding and brought together by hard work and honest transformation. "Maria asked me something," Simone said. "She asked if I'd forgiven you for what I did. I told her that wasn't the right question." "What's the right question?" Patricia asked. "Whether I'd forgiven myself, whether I'd become someone worth forgiving." Patricia looked at her daughter, at the woman who'd forged documents and stolen millions and erased her mother from her own business, at the woman who'd spent 2 years working in kitchens until her hands were rough and her feet ached and her assumptions had been shattered by reality, at the woman who now taught others not to make the same mistakes. "Are you?" Patricia asked. "Someone worth forgiving?" Simone considered this carefully. "I'm becoming someone who sees, who recognizes value where I saw nothing, who credits the people doing the actual work of building and feeding and creating community. I'm not there yet. Maybe I never fully will be, but I'm trying." "That's all any of us can do. Try, learn, build. Show up every day and do the work," Patricia said. They walked out together into the Los Angeles evening, the air thick with the smell of street tacos and car exhaust and the complex urban aroma of millions of people all trying to build lives of purpose and meaning. Patricia thought about Daniel, about the 35 years they'd built together, about how he'd given her credit privately while accepting public recognition, about how he'd changed the ownership structure to protect her, seeing something she hadn't seen, that their partnership needed legal documentation because the world didn't naturally recognize women's contributions. He knew, before she did, and he'd protected her in the only way he knew how. 6 months later, the Heritage Kitchen Institute had graduated its second cohort and had a waiting list of 300 applicants. The 4 Casa Morales restaurants Patricia had retained were thriving under her management. The franchise locations were successful, paying licensing fees that funded scholarships for culinary students. Simone ran the Institute's business program, teaching students how to navigate legal structures, secure financing, negotiate contracts, all while emphasizing the importance of recognizing and crediting the operational work that made businesses actually function. And Rosa's daughter Maria opened her first restaurant, a small place in Boyle Heights that specialized in fusion cuisine and employed recently graduated immigrants, offering the same dignity and respect Patricia had modeled decades earlier. On a Tuesday afternoon, Patricia stood in her original Casa Morales kitchen, the one that's now a teaching space, and looked at 20 new students just beginning their journey. "Before we start, I want to tell you about my grandmother, about the woman who taught me these recipes, about how she fled Mexico during the Revolution with nothing but her knowledge and her determination to feed her family. She pulled out the original handwritten recipes, yellowed with age, stained with decades of use. These aren't more than cooking instructions. They're legacy. They're the accumulated wisdom of women who understood that feeding people is sacred work, that creating gathering places matters, that the daily labor of building community is what holds civilization together. She looked around at faces hungry for knowledge, for opportunity, for the chance to build something lasting. You're going to learn these recipes. You're going to master these techniques. But more importantly, you're going to learn that your work matters, that your contributions have value, that the person doing the daily labor of keeping kitchens running and customers fed and standards maintained, that person is building civilization. One student raised her hand. What if people don't see that? What if they dismiss us? Patricia smiled. Then you do the work so well that dismissal becomes absurd. You build something so undeniably valuable that it can't be ignored. And you teach the next generation, like I'm teaching you, that some work is too important to be invisible. She opened her grandmother's recipe for mole sauce. This is where we start, with the most complex dish, with the one that requires patience and precision and years of practice to master, because that's what building something lasting requires. Patricia Morales was 67 years old. She'd been betrayed by her daughter, erased from her own business, dismissed as just the cook for 35 years. But she'd chosen transformation over destruction, education over revenge, building over burning down. And in that choice, she'd created something more lasting than 8 successful restaurants. She created a legacy of women who saw their own value, who refused to be invisible, who built gathering places and fed communities and understood that their daily labor was sacred work. Maria, Rosa's daughter, stood in the back of the classroom observing. She was writing a follow-up essay about Patricia for a food magazine, about the woman who turned betrayal into education, who chose wisdom over revenge, who built something beautiful from something broken. The essay would be titled "The Kitchen That Taught Me Justice." It would be about understanding that justice isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's transformation. Sometimes it's making sure the next generation doesn't repeat the mistakes of the last. Sometimes justice is just showing people what they were too blind to see and teaching them how to see differently. Patricia caught Maria's eye and nodded. The girl nodded back, understanding passing between them, without words. This was the legacy, not the restaurants, not the money, not even the recipes, though those mattered. The legacy was this: women learning to see their own value, learning to demand credit for their contributions, learning to build something so undeniably important that invisibility became impossible, one student at a time, one kitchen at a time, one generation teaching the next that some work is too sacred to be dismissed. Patricia turned back to her students and began teaching them the first step of the mole sauce, toasting chilies until their aroma filled the room with the smell of transformation, of complexity, of something simple becoming extraordinary through patience and skill and attention to detail. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual chaos. Millions of people all trying to build lives, all searching for places that felt like home, all hungry for food that tasted like someone cared about feeding them. And inside Patricia's kitchen, 20 women learned that feeding people well is how you change the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through showing up every day, doing the work, building something lasting, teaching the next generation to see value where others saw nothing. That was revolution. That was justice. That was legacy. And it tasted like her grandmother's mole sauce, complex, layered, built from simple ingredients transformed through skill and patience into something transcendent, something that couldn't be dismissed, something that demanded to be tasted, remembered, passed down, something that said, "This matters, I matter, we matter." And in that mattering, everything changed.